The Black History of Slavery in Africa. Slavery is an institution that has existed in various forms throughout human history. The Black History of Slavery in Africa is a complex and multifaceted narrative that encompasses centuries of exploitation, resilience, and profound cultural transformations. This comprehensive account delves into the origins, mechanisms, and consequences of slavery on the African continent, exploring its legacy and enduring impact on contemporary African societies. Origins of slavery in Africa. Slavery in Africa predates the arrival of Europeans and the transatlantic slave trade by many centuries. It was deeply ingrained in various African societies and took on multiple forms. In ancient times, slavery often resulted from warfare, where captives were taken as spoils of war and forced into servitude. Additionally, debt bondage, punishment for crimes, and familial obligations could lead to enslavement. Pre-Islamic and Islamic influences. Ancient kingdoms and empires. In regions such as Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, slavery was practiced as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. Slaves in these ancient societies were used for domestic work, agriculture, mining, and military service. Islamic expansion. With the advent of Islam in the 7th century CE, the practice of slavery became more systematized. The Quran and Hadiths allowed slavery but also advocated for humane treatment and the eventual manumission of slaves. The Islamic slave trade routes, including the trans-Saharan and East African slave trades, facilitated the movement of African slaves to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Traditional African practices. Kinship and slavery. In many African societies, slavery was integrated into kinship structures. Slaves were often considered part of the extended family, albeit with a lower status. They could marry, own property, and even rise to prominent positions within the community. Economic and social roles. Slaves played crucial roles in agricultural production, artisanal crafts, and trade. They were essential to the economic stability and prosperity of their owners' households and broader communities. The transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This brutal system was driven by European colonial powers and had devastating effects on African societies. European involvement. Portuguese initiatives. The Portuguese were among the first Europeans to engage in the African slave trade. In the mid-15th century, they established trading posts along the West African coast, where they exchanged goods for slaves. Expansion by other powers. Following the Portuguese, other European nations, including Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, entered the lucrative slave trade. The demand for labor in the New World plantations, particularly in sugar, tobacco, and cotton industries, fueled the increase in slave trading activities. Mechanisms of capture and transport. African middlemen. European traders rarely ventured inland. Instead, they relied on African middlemen and powerful local leaders to capture and supply slaves. These intermediaries often conducted raids on neighboring communities or capitalized on existing conflicts to procure slaves. The Middle Passage. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a horrific ordeal. Slaves were packed tightly into ships under inhumane conditions, leading to high mortality rates due to disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Impact on African societies. Demographic changes. The transatlantic slave trade significantly depopulated certain regions, leading to demographic imbalances and labor shortages. Some estimates suggest that up to 12 million Africans were transported to the Americas, with countless others dying during raids or in transit. Economic disruption. The loss of a substantial portion of the population disrupted traditional economies and agricultural practices. The focus on capturing slaves also diverted resources and attention from other productive activities. Political instability. The slave trade exacerbated conflicts and power struggles within and between African states. The introduction of European firearms intensified these conflicts, leading to the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires. The internal slave trade. While the transatlantic slave trade is the most well-known, internal slave trades within Africa also had significant impacts. These networks facilitated the movement of slaves across different regions of the continent and were often intertwined with external trades. Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades. Trans-Saharan routes. Slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert to North Africa and the Middle East. This trade was particularly prominent from the 8th century onwards and involved the movement of slaves, gold, ivory, and other goods. Indian Ocean trade. The East African coast was integrated into the Indian Ocean trade network. Slaves from this region were sent to the Middle East, Persia, India, and even Southeast Asia. The Swahili coast, including cities like Zanzibar, became major slave trading hubs. Domestic and regional trades. West African networks. In West Africa, extensive slave trading networks existed, linking different ethnic groups and regions. The demand for slaves in the transatlantic trade also stimulated internal trading activities. Central and Southern Africa. Regions like the Congo Basin and present-day Angola were heavily involved in supplying slaves for both internal and external markets. The Lunda and Luba empires, for instance, were significant players in the regional slave trade. Abolition and resistance. The abolition of slavery in Africa was a protracted and complex process, influenced by internal resistance, external pressure, and changing economic dynamics. The struggle against slavery involved both organized movements and individual acts of defiance. Internal resistance. Slave revolts. Throughout history, enslaved Africans resisted their condition through revolts and uprisings. These acts of defiance, though often brutally suppressed, demonstrated the resilience and agency of enslaved individuals. Maroon communities. Escaped slaves formed independent communities, known as Maroons, in remote areas. These communities often waged guerrilla warfare against slave traders and colonial authorities. Abolition movements. European abolitionism. The rise of abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas in the 18th and 19th centuries exerted significant pressure on African and colonial powers to end the slave trade. Prominent figures like Olaudah Equiano, a former slave, played crucial roles in advocating for abolition. Colonial policies. In the 19th century, European colonial powers began to outlaw the slave trade and slavery, partly due to humanitarian concerns and partly because of changing economic interests. The British Royal Navy, for example, patrolled the West African coast to intercept slave ships. Enduring legacies. Post-abolition struggles. Despite legal abolition, slavery and forced labor persisted in various forms. Enslaved individuals often faced significant challenges in gaining freedom and integrating into society. Socioeconomic impact. The legacy of slavery continues to affect African societies today. Issues such as economic disparities, social stratification, and inter-ethnic tensions can be traced back to the historical impacts of slavery. Contemporary reflections. Understanding the history of slavery in Africa is crucial for comprehending contemporary African societies and their global interactions. The legacies of slavery continue to shape cultural, social, and political dynamics across the continent. Cultural memory and identity. Heritage and remembrance. Many African communities actively remember and honor the history of slavery through cultural practices, memorials, and storytelling. These acts of remembrance serve as important tools for preserving historical consciousness and fostering resilience. Diaspora connections. The African diaspora, particularly in the Americas, maintains deep connections with the continent. Initiatives such as the Year of Return in Ghana encourage people of African descent to reconnect with their heritage and contribute to African development. Economic and social development. Addressing historical injustices. Efforts to address the historical injustices of slavery include reparations, educational initiatives, and economic programs aimed at redressing past harms. These initiatives seek to create a more equitable and just society. Modern forms of slavery. Contemporary forms of slavery, such as human trafficking, forced labor, and child exploitation, continue to pose significant challenges. Combating these issues requires robust legal frameworks, international cooperation, and grassroots activism. Global perspectives.